He didn't know I'd been headhunted by his company's parent corporation until I walked into his department as the new executive director, with full authority to review his position. The look on my husband's face as he sat beside his secretary-turned-girlfriend was worth every tear I'd ever cried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You really need to sign these papers, Vanessa, Richard said, sliding the divorce settlement across my kitchen table in what was once our home. His platinum watch gleamed under the pendant lights I'd installed last spring, the same lights he'd complained were unnecessarily expensive when I'd shown him the catalog. Behind him, Melanie hovered near the doorway, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching her designer purse, a birthday gift from Richard that cost more than he'd spent on my last 3 birthdays combined. My replacement was 27, while I had just turned 42. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "We have dinner reservations at Maison Laurent," she murmured, just loud enough for me to hear the name of the French restaurant where Richard had proposed to me 16 years earlier. Her eyes darted around my kitchen with that barely disguised look of superiority, as though assessing a territory she'd conquered without effort. I kept my expression neutral as I flipped through the inadequate settlement offer. Page after page attempted to minimize 15 years of partnership into a paltry financial arrangement that would leave me struggling while Richard maintained his lifestyle with his new upgrade. This document was the culmination of Richard's 6-month affair, though I suspected it had been going on much longer. "The division of assets seems rather one-sided," I said, pausing at the section about our investment portfolio, the one I'd researched and recommended after Richard's financial advisor had nearly bankrupted us during the market crash of 2008. "That's how these things go, Van," Richard replied with practiced sympathy, using the nickname I'd once found endearing. "You'll get the condo, which is frankly generous considering it's in my name." What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that tomorrow morning I would be stepping into my new role as Executive Director of Operations at Westridge Communications Group, the parent company that had acquired Richard's firm 3 months ago. The same acquisition Richard had dismissed as just corporate paperwork when I'd asked if his position might be affected. "I'll have my lawyer review these," I said quietly, sliding the papers into a folder without signing. "I'm sure we can come to a fair arrangement," Richard sighed theatrically, exchanging a knowing glance with Melanie. The look between them was familiar. It was the same one he used to share with me when he thought someone was being difficult or unreasonable. "Let's be practical," he said, leaning forward, his tone shifting to what I recognized as his closing the deal voice. "Your position at the Community Development Foundation barely covers your expenses now. The alimony I'm offering is more than fair considering the circumstances." The circumstances. His delicate phrasing for being caught with Melanie in our bed 3 months ago, when I'd come home early from a conference with food poisoning. I'd spent the night vomiting in our guest bathroom while they hastily gathered their clothes and made excuses. "And it's not like you contributed significantly to my career," he continued, straightening his custom-tailored suit. "Don't drag this out, Van. We both know your nonprofit salary can't afford a prolonged legal battle. Be reasonable. If only—" He knew that while he'd been taking Melanie to business dinners, I'd been quietly interviewing with Catherine Westridge herself, the CEO who'd been impressed with the efficiency initiatives I'd implemented across multiple nonprofit organizations. The same initiatives Richard had once dismissed as cute little management tricks for volunteer organizations when I'd tried to explain them over dinner. "Your foundation work is charming," he'd said last Christmas at his company party, his arm already lingering too long around Melanie's waist. "But real business requires a different approach. Catherine Westridge hadn't thought my approach was charming. She'd called it revolutionary, and had spent 3 separate interviews discussing how my methodologies could transform their newly acquired subsidiaries, including Meridian Communications, where Richard had been inflating his department's performance metrics for years. years. Melanie cleared her throat dramatically, glancing at her watch. Another expensive gift that Richard had bought during a business trip I'd helped him prepare for. "Richard, we really should go," she said, her tone making it clear she wanted to escape my presence as quickly as possible. "Sometimes being reasonable takes time," I replied, standing to show them out. In my handbag, my phone buzzed with an email confirming tomorrow's 9 a.m. all-hands meeting, the meeting where Richard would discover exactly who would be evaluating his department's performance going forward. "I hope you're not going to be difficult about this," Richard said, his facade of reasonableness slipping slightly. "It's better for everyone if we handle this quietly and quickly." I smiled slightly. I'm all for handling things professionally. What Richard failed to realize was that I had spent 15 years helping him climb the corporate ladder, researching industry trends for his presentations, editing his reports, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues, all while building my own career in the nonprofit sector. I had been his uncredited partner in every promotion, every bonus, every accolade, and now I would be his boss. "I'll be in touch about the papers," I said, holding the door open. As they walked to Richard's luxury car, the midnight blue BMW I'd encouraged him to buy to celebrate the promotion I'd helped him prepare for, I allowed myself a small smile. Richard helped Melanie into the passenger seat with the same careful attention he'd once shown me, before our marriage had become another item on his career checklist. Tomorrow, at exactly 9 a.m., everything would change. My phone buzzed again with a message from Catherine. "All set for tomorrow. Can't wait to see what you'll do with Meridian." In less than 24 hours, Richard would learn that underestimating me had been the biggest miscalculation of his career. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to take a moment to thank each of you who've joined me on this journey. If you're new here, welcome to a community where we share stories of resilience, reinvention, and yes, sometimes a little well-deserved karma. If you're finding value in this story of professional transformation, consider subscribing to our channel. It costs nothing but means everything as we build this community of survivors and thrivers. Your support helps us reach others who might need to hear that setbacks, even heartbreaking ones, can become setups for incredible comebacks. Many of you have shared your own stories of betrayal and redemption in the comments of my previous videos. Know that I read every single one, and you inspire me as much as I hope these stories inspire you. This community has become a lifeline for so many, and I'm grateful to be part of your journey. Now, let me take you back to that night after Richard and Melanie left. The night before everything changed, I closed my front door and leaned against it, allowing myself exactly 60 seconds to feel the familiar ache in my chest. 1 minute of weakness before strength became necessary again. The house felt emptier than usual tonight. The spaces Richard once occupied now filled with the ghost of what I had thought was a solid marriage. I moved to my home office, the smallest bedroom that Richard had reluctantly allowed me to claim when we bought the house. "It's not like you need the space for anything important," he'd said. The same office where I'd spent countless evenings helping him prepare presentations while he claimed credit at work the next day. On my desk sat the folder containing my employment contract with Westridge Communications Group. The journey, too. This moment had begun long before Richard's affair, perhaps the day 5 years ago when I realized I had become invisible to my husband. We had been at his company's holiday party. I was wearing a red dress I'd carefully selected, feeling confident and beautiful for the first time in months. "Who handles your foundation's operational logistics?" Martin Chen had asked me, genuinely interested in the nonprofit efficiency model I'd developed. Before I could answer, Richard had appeared at my side, champagne in hand. "Don't bore Martin with charity talk, darling," he'd said with a condescending smile. "Martin, you should hear about the Henderson account we just landed." Later that night, watching Richard hold court with his colleagues, my ideas reduced to charity talk, something had shifted inside me. I realized I had spent years dimming my light to make Richard shine brighter. The following Monday, I'd updated my resume. What Richard never understood was that my work at the Community Development Foundation wasn't just playing office, as he'd once thoughtlessly remarked. I had transformed a struggling organization into one of the most efficient nonprofits in the region, stretching every donation dollar to maximum impact through innovative operational models that corporate America was only beginning to discover. My phone rang, pulling me from the memory. Catherine Westridge's name flashed on the screen. "Vanessa, sorry to call so late." Her confident voice came through the speaker. At 62, Catherine had built Westridge Communications from a small regional company into a national powerhouse. "Just checking that we're all set for tomorrow." "Everything's prepared," I assured her, pulling up the presentation I'd created for the all-hands meeting. "I've reviewed the departmental assessments and have initial recommendations ready, including your husband's department," she asked directly. Catherine had been surprised during my final interview when I'd disclosed that Richard worked at Meridian, one of the companies Westridge had recently acquired. "Ex-husband," I corrected. "And yes, including his department. No special treatment. Positive or negative." There was a pause on the line. "That's why I hired you, Vanessa. Your ability to separate personal feelings from professional assessments is remarkable, though I admit I'm curious to see his face when you walk in." I smiled despite myself. I may position myself to get a good view. The call ended, and I walked to the window, staring out at the neighborhood Richard and I had chosen together. The same neighborhood he would likely continue living in with Melanie. The thought no longer stung as sharply as it once had. Tomorrow would bring a shift in our power dynamic that no divorce settlement could capture. I checked my watch, almost midnight. In 9 hours, everything would change. Not just for me, but for Richard, for Melanie, and for everyone at Meridian. Communications who had accepted Richard's version of me, the supportive wife with the cute little nonprofit job. Tomorrow they would meet Vanessa Mitchell, Executive Director of Operations at Westridge Communications Group, with the authority to restructure departments, reassign personnel, and yes, review the performance of every division head, including Richard. I closed the curtains and headed to bed, setting my alarm for 5:30 a.m. My new life was waiting, and I needed to be rested to fully enjoy its arrival. My journey to the executive director position at Westridge hadn't happened overnight. It was the culmination of years of underestimated potential and quiet determination. Richard and I had met at Meridian Communications 16 years ago, when it was still an independent, mid-sized marketing firm. I was working in their client relations department, helping to streamline their customer retention processes. Richard was a junior account executive with a dazzling smile and ambitious dreams. The attraction had been immediate and intense. "You're different from the other women I've dated," he'd told me during our third date. "You actually understand what I do." Not only did I understand it, but I had valuable insights. Early in our relationship, Richard had often sought my advice on client presentations and strategy proposals. My suggestions frequently became the backbone of his most successful pitches. 6 months after we started dating, I was offered a position at the Community Development Foundation, a struggling nonprofit with a worthy mission, but disastrous operational efficiency. The salary was less than I made at Meridian, but the challenge excited me. "It's sweet that you want to help people," Richard had said when I told him I was taking the job. "Just don't expect me to volunteer at any soup kitchens." I hadn't expected soup kitchens. I had expected respect for my career choice, but even then, I'd dismissed the warning sign, attributing his dismissiveness to the stress of his upcoming performance review. We married a year later in a ceremony that, looking back, was more about impressing Richard's colleagues than celebrating our union. Our wedding photos showed a beaming couple, Richard proud of his beautiful bride, me proud of the man I believed would be my partner in all things. The first 5 years of our marriage had been good ones. We bought our house, traveled during vacations, and built what I thought was a solid foundation. Richard was climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian, and I was systematically transforming the foundation from a financial disaster into a model of nonprofit efficiency. The donors were shocked when I showed them our new operational metrics, I'd told Richard over dinner one night, excited about doubling our program impact without increasing costs. The Willerton Foundation has agreed to triple their annual commitment. That's nice, honey, he'd responded, barely looking up from his phone. Listen, Thompson is coming over for dinner Thursday. Can you make that roast he liked last time? I'd made the roast, and I'd hosted Thompson, making insightful comments about market trends that Richard later incorporated into his strategic planning. I'd become not just Richard's wife, but his uncredited business consultant, personal assistant, and social coordinator. The Community Development Foundation continued to flourish under my leadership. We expanded our programs to 5 counties, quadrupled our budget while keeping administrative costs below industry averages, and developed an operational model that other nonprofits began to emulate. Vanessa Mitchell from the Community Development Foundation. A woman had approached me at a charity gala 3 years ago. I've heard remarkable things about your efficiency initiatives. I'm Catherine Westridge. Catherine Westridge was a legend in the communications industry, having built her company from nothing into a major player. We'd spent 30 minutes discussing operational innovations, during which she asked increasingly specific questions about my methodologies. You should be teaching this to the corporate sector, she'd said as our conversation ended. They're paying consultants millions for insights, less valuable than yours. I'd mentioned the encounter to Richard that night as we drove home, feeling a rare spark of professional pride. Westridge Communications is small potatoes, he'd responded dismissively. Their market share is nothing compared to the major players Meridian works with. What Richard hadn't known, or hadn't cared to know, was that Westridge had been strategically acquiring companies across the communications sector, building a diverse portfolio that would eventually include Meridian. Meanwhile, Richard's attitude toward me had shifted subtly. As he rose to department head, then division director, the equal partnership of our early years eroded. My insights, once valued, became cute suggestions. My career accomplishments were reduced to charitable work when introduced to his colleagues. I noticed him developing a pattern with his assistants, hiring attractive young women, mentoring them closely, then finding reasons they needed to leave just as our social circle began noticing his attentiveness. I had ignored the signs, telling myself I was being paranoid, until Melanie arrived. Melanie Parker was 27, with a business degree from a respectable state university, and an uncanny ability to laugh at all of Richard's jokes. Unlike his previous assistants, she had stayed longer than a year, becoming increasingly indispensable to him professionally, and, as I would discover, personally. The changes were almost imperceptible at first. Late nights at the office, weekend, emergency client situations, business trips that hadn't appeared on his calendar until the last minute. Richard became more critical of me, commenting on my matronly wardrobe, suggesting I consider cosmetic procedures to freshen up, wondering aloud why I didn't take more pride in my appearance like Melanie. She's just naturally put together, he'd said once after a company dinner where Melanie had appeared in a dress that cost more than my monthly charitable donation budget. Some women just understand presentation is part of the professional package. I'd looked down at my perfectly appropriate cocktail dress, the one Richard had once said brought out my eyes, and felt a familiar twinge of inadequacy. Later that night, I'd caught them laughing together near the bar, his hand lingering at the small of her back in a gesture of intimacy he rarely showed me anymore in public. Still, I might have continued in blissful denial had it not been for that fateful day when food poisoning brought me home early from my conference. Finding them in our bed had been both devastating and clarifying, like having a suspicion confirmed in the most painful way possible. It just happened, Richard had claimed afterward, once I'd stopped vomiting long enough to have the conversation. It didn't mean anything. But the text messages I discovered on his tablet told a different story. Months of exchanges, plans made, intimacies shared. When confronted with the evidence, Richard's remorse had quickly transformed into rationalization. "You've been distant," he'd countered. "Always wrapped up in your foundation work. A man has needs, Vanessa." 2 days later, he'd moved out, taking only what he immediately needed and leaving me in a house full of memories and betrayal. 3 weeks after that, he'd informed me he was filing for divorce. "Melanie and I want to start fresh," he'd explained, as though his decision were the most reasonable thing in the world. "You'll be fine. The foundation gives your life meaning, right?" What Richard couldn't see, what he had never been able to see, was that I had outgrown him professionally years ago. While he was climbing the corporate ladder one predictable rung at a time, I had been innovating systems that caught the attention of someone like Catherine Westridge. 2 months after Richard moved out, Catherine had called me directly. "Vanessa, I've been following your work for years," she'd said. "Westridge Communications has recently acquired several companies that need exactly your type of operational expertise. Would you consider bringing your methodologies to the corporate sector?" The timing had seemed almost cosmic, a professional lifeline appearing just when my personal life had collapsed. 3 rounds of interviews had followed, each more intensive than the last. I'd presented my efficiency models to increasingly senior teams, translating nonprofit innovations to corporate challenges. During the final interview, Catherine had revealed that Meridian Communications was among the recent acquisitions. "I should disclose that my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, works there," I'd told her. "He heads the communications strategy division." Catherine had studied me carefully. "Would that create a conflict for you?" "Not for me," I'd answered honestly. "I can separate personal history from professional assessment." She'd nodded, seemingly satisfied. "That's good to hear, because I need someone who can make difficult decisions based on data, not relationships. The division you mentioned needs particular attention." 2 weeks later, Catherine had called with the offer: Executive Director of Operations for the entire Westridge Group, with authority to review and restructure all divisions of their newly acquired companies, reporting directly to her. The salary was 3 times what I made at the foundation, with stock options that could eventually make me a significant shareholder. "We want you to start with Meridian," Catherine had said. "Their operational metrics look impressive on paper, but something doesn't add up in their client retention patterns." I'd accepted immediately, giving the foundation a generous notice period while quietly preparing for my new role. Throughout it all, I hadn't breathed a word to Richard. Not when he called about dividing our assets, not when he stopped by to collect more of his things, not even when he pressured me to sign the divorce papers quickly so he could move on with his life. Let him think I was still the nonprofit director he'd dismissed. Let him believe I would struggle financially without him. Let him imagine I would fade into the background of his life story. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., Richard would discover just how profoundly he had underestimated me. The morning of the revelation dawned clear and bright. I woke before my alarm, my body humming with anticipation. After a quick shower, I stood before my closet, contemplating my armor for the day. Richard had always criticized my safe wardrobe choices. "Would it kill you to wear something with a little flair?" he'd ask when we were heading to company functions. "Melanie manages to look professional and stylish." Today, I selected the charcoal Armani suit I'd purchased specifically for my new role. Tailored perfectly to my frame, with subtle power shoulders and a silhouette that conveyed authority without trying too hard. I paired it with a silk blouse in deep teal, a color Richard had once said made my eyes almost pretty. The Louboutin heels I'd treated myself to after accepting the Westridge offer added 4 inches to my height, bringing me eye level with most men in the office, including Richard. As I applied my makeup, professional but enhanced, following the session with the image consultant Catherine had recommended. I studied my reflection. At 42, I wasn't trying to compete with Melanie's youth. Instead, I was embracing something she couldn't touch, the gravitas that comes from genuine accomplishment. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Car will pick you up at 7:30. Let's have coffee before the meeting." Perfect. That would give us time to review the presentation and for me to center myself before the main event. The luxury sedan Catherine had sent arrived precisely on schedule. As we glided through morning traffic toward Meridian's downtown office, I reviewed my notes one final time. Richard's department showed a 97% client retention rate, significantly above industry standards and even higher than Meridian's other divisions. On paper, it looked impressive. In reality, it was statistically improbable. My preliminary research had uncovered a pattern. Richard's team was counting verbal renewals and even positive client feedback as confirmed contracts. Several major accounts listed as secured had actually moved to competitors within weeks of supposedly renewing with Meridian. It wasn't outright fraud, but it was deliberately misleading, a pattern of data manipulation that had likely contributed to Richard's rapid promotions. The car pulled up to Meridian's sleek glass building. Unlike yesterday when I'd visited Richard, as his soon-to-be ex-wife, today I entered through the executive entrance, swiping the access card Catherine had provided. The security guard straightened as I approached. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. Ms. Westridge is waiting for you in the executive lounge on the top floor." The executive elevator, restricted to senior management, whisked me to the 30th floor. I'd never been to this part of the building during my visits to see Richard. His division operated on the 22nd floor, and he'd always made it clear that the top floors were reserved for the people who actually run things. Catherine Westridge stood as I entered the luxurious lounge with its panoramic views of the city. At 62, she exuded the confidence of someone who had built an empire through intelligence and grit, rather than connections or pedigree. "Vanessa," she greeted me warmly, gesturing to the coffee service arranged on the table. "You look exactly like what Meridian needs, a professional who won't be swayed by office politics or creative accounting." "I appreciate the vote of confidence," I replied, accepting the cup she offered. "The acquisition team has identified several operational concerns at Meridian," Catherine continued, pulling out a tablet. "Most pressing is the Communications Strategy Division's puzzling client retention metrics." "I've examined those," I confirmed. "They're reporting numbers that don't align with industry standards or even basic probability models. I've prepared a detailed analysis." I pulled up my findings on my tablet, showing Catherine the discrepancies between reported renewals and actual client behavior. They're counting handshake agreements and even positive meetings as confirmed contracts. When the clients eventually leave, which several major ones have, the departures are categorized as market shifts rather than losses. Catherine studied the data, her expression hardening. "This is exactly why I brought you in. You see patterns? Others miss." She glanced at her watch. "The all-hands meeting starts in 30 minutes. The Meridian executive team doesn't know exactly what's happening today. They've been told only that they're meeting their new operational leadership." "And Richard?" I couldn't help asking. A small smile played at Catherine's lips. "He's been particularly interested in making a good impression. He sent me 3 emails this week with suggestions for optimizing the integration process. He seems to think he's being considered for a promotion." The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard had always been ambitious, constantly positioning himself for the next opportunity. He wouldn't just be surprised to see me walk in as his new boss. He would be devastated to learn that the promotion he'd been angling for had gone to his underachieving wife. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked, studying my face. I took a deep breath, remembering all the times Richard had dismissed my career as playing at business, all the dinner parties where he'd cut me off mid-sentence to redirect conversations. Away from my professional insights, all the condescending explanations of basic business concepts I'd understood far better than he did. More than ready, I assured her. We spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the presentation I'd prepared for the meeting. My plan was comprehensive but fair, a systematic review of all departments with clear metrics for success and specific areas for improvement. Richard's division wasn't singled out for criticism. All departments would face the same scrutiny. The difference was that most would meet the reasonable standards I'd established. His, with its misleading reporting, would. At 8:45, Catherine's assistant appeared at the lounge door. The executive team is assembling in the main conference room, she reported. Mr. Mitchell is seated in the front row, as requested. Catherine raised an eyebrow at me. I allowed myself a small smile. I may have mentioned to the coordinator that Mr. Mitchell had exceptional engagement with strategic presentations. Nicely played, Catherine approved. Shall we? We gathered our materials and made our way to the executive conference room on the 28th floor. Through the glass walls, I could see Meridian's leadership team taking their seats, 15 men and 4 women, all in their corporate finest. In the front row, as promised, sat Richard, his dark hair freshly cut, his posture radiating the confident expectation of someone who believed he was about to be recognized. Beside him, to my surprise, sat Melanie, notepad at the ready. She must have been promoted from executive assistant to an actual role in his department, something that would have required approval from someone in HR who owed Richard a favor. The sight of them sitting side by side in matching navy suits, looking for all the world like Meridian's power couple, might have wounded me once. Today, it was merely the perfect dramatic setup. Catherine motioned for me to wait in the adjacent preparation room while she made the initial announcements. Through the door, I could hear her commanding voice addressing the assembled executives. Good morning, Meridian leadership. As you know, Westridge Communications has been systematically reviewing all our new acquisitions to identify operational strengths and areas for improvement. Today, I'm introducing the executive who will be overseeing Meridian's integration and optimization. Someone with exceptional expertise in operational efficiency and a proven track record of transforming underperforming systems. I checked my appearance one final time in the room's small mirror, straightening my suit jacket and squaring my shoulders. In my peripheral vision, I could see Richard leaning forward eagerly, likely rehearsing his congratulatory remarks to whomever he assumed would be named. Probably someone he'd already researched and prepared to impress. Please join me in welcoming Westridge Communications' new Executive Director of Operations, Vanessa Mitchell. With perfect timing, I stepped through the door into the conference room. The collective intake of breath was audible, but I kept my eyes forward, walking confidently to join Catherine at the presentation podium. Only when I reached my position did I allow myself to focus on the front row, on Richard's face as it transformed from expectant ambition to shocked disbelief. His mouth had actually fallen open, his carefully cultivated executive poise shattered in an instant. Beside him, Melanie was frantically looking between us, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and alarm. Thank you, Catherine, I said, my voice steady and professional. I'm looking forward to working with the Meridian team, to build on your strengths and address the challenges ahead. Richard's face had drained of color, his eyes locked on mine in a silent plea that communicated volumes. Don't do this. Please don't do this. For 15 years, I had responded to that look by backing down, by diminishing myself to protect his ego. Not today. For those who don't know me, I continued smoothly, my gaze sweeping the room before returning deliberately to the front row. I bring 15 years of experience in operational transformation, most recently as director of the Community Development Foundation, where I pioneered efficiency systems that have been adopted across the nonprofit sector. The executives were nodding politely, though many were clearly distracted by Richard's visible distress. Whispers had begun at the back of the room, as those who knew of Richard's personal life made the connection. I've spent the past month conducting a thorough review of Meridian's operations, I continued, advancing to the first slide of my presentation. Today, I'll outline our initial findings and the framework for optimization moving forward. Richard had recovered enough to adopt a rigid mask of professionalism, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his inner turmoil. Melanie was staring, fixedly at her notepad, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. As I launched into my presentation, detailing the organizational assessment with clear metrics and specific recommendations, I could see Richard gradually processing the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just an uncomfortable coincidence. This was his soon-to-be ex-wife assuming direct authority over his professional future at precisely the moment he was trying to pressure me into an unfavorable divorce settlement. The cosmic timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd orchestrated it myself. As my presentation progressed through the departmental assessments, I maintained a thoroughly professional demeanor. This wasn't about humiliating Richard. It was about demonstrating my competence and establishing my authority within Meridian. The fact that it simultaneously shattered his perception of me was simply a satisfying side effect. Most departments are performing at or above industry standards, I explained, displaying a comparative chart. However, we've identified 3 divisions that require immediate attention. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the communications, strategy division, Richard's department, highlighted in red at the bottom of the performance metrics. A murmur rippled through the room. Richard's division had been widely considered Meridian's crown jewel, largely due to his creative reporting. Seeing it flagged as underperforming contradicted the narrative he'd carefully constructed over years. Communication strategy shows concerning discrepancies between reported client retention and actual account status, I continued, my voice measured and factual. Our audit revealed that 43% of clients listed as renewed in the past 18 months have either reduced their contracts significantly or moved to competitors entirely. Richard shifted in his seat, his expression hardening. This was his first realization that I wasn't just his boss in title. I had actually investigated his work and found it wanting. Specifically, I continued, clicking to a detailed analysis, we found that verbal commitments were being recorded as confirmed renewals, and client departures were being categorized as market shifts rather than losses. This created an artificial success rate that doesn't reflect actual performance. The executives were now openly staring at Richard, whose face had flushed dark red. Beside him, Melanie was frantically scribbling notes, likely trying to think of ways to explain away the damning statistics. To address these concerns, I said, advancing to the next slide, we'll be implementing standardized reporting protocols across all divisions with particular attention to verifiable client commitments. Additionally, each division head will participate in weekly transparency reviews during the transition period. I paused, making deliberate eye contact with Richard. These measures aren't punitive, they're corrective. Our goal is to build a culture of authentic achievement rather than inflated metrics. Catherine nodded approvingly beside me. She understood what I was doing, establishing that this wasn't personal vengeance, but professional assessment. The fact that it happened to expose Richard's creative accounting was simply good business. As I moved on to the implementation timeline, Richard raised his hand. The gesture was so unexpected that I momentarily paused. Yes, Mr. Mitchell? I acknowledged, using his last name just as I had with the other executives who had asked questions. I'd like to address the assessment of my division, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Our reporting methods have been consistent with Meridian's established practices for years. This characterization seems selective. The implication was clear. He was suggesting I was targeting him personally. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, sensing the undercurrent of tension. An excellent observation, I replied smoothly. In fact, our audit revealed inconsistent reporting standards across several departments, which is precisely why we're implementing unified protocols. However, communication strategy showed the most significant deviation between reported and actual performance metrics. I clicked to a slide I'd prepared anticipating this very objection. A comparative analysis showing that while other departments had some reporting inconsistencies, none approached the systematic inflation present in Richard's division. The data speaks for itself, I concluded. Any other questions? Richard's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. He knew better than to create a scene in front of the entire executive team. Beside him, Melanie looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. I continued with the presentation, outlining the transition timeline and integration goals. Throughout, I remained poised and thoroughly professional, never once acknowledging the personal connection between Richard and myself. To everyone except those who already knew, I was simply an experienced executive doing her job. As I concluded the formal presentation, Catherine stepped forward to address next steps. Ms. Mitchell will be scheduling individual meetings with each division head over the coming week to develop department-specific action plans. Your calendar invitations should arrive by end of day. Richard's eyes darted to his phone, likely checking to see if his meeting had already been scheduled. I had deliberately left his for last, planning to send it only after this meeting concluded. That concludes our presentation, Catherine announced. Thank you all for your attention. Division heads, please remain for a brief Q&A session. Others are dismissed to return to your departments. As the room began to clear, leaving only the senior leadership team, Richard remained rigidly in his seat. Melanie hesitated beside him, clearly uncertain whether she should stay. This session is for division heads only, Catherine clarified, looking pointedly at Melanie. You'll receive detailed notes afterward. Flushing with embarrassment, Melanie gathered her things and hurried from the room, casting a concerned glance at Richard as she left. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow emphasized the tension filling the space. Once only the division heads remained, Catherine opened the floor for questions. Several were raised about the implementation timeline and reporting requirements, which I addressed with clear, specific answers. Richard remained conspicuously silent, his expression unreadable. Finally, as the Q&A wound down, he spoke up. Will these changes affect the annual performance reviews scheduled for next month? His question seemed innocent enough, but I recognized the calculation behind it. The performance reviews were tied to bonuses and promotions. He was worried about his financial future. The annual review cycle will proceed as scheduled, I confirmed. However, the criteria will incorporate our new reporting standards. This provides everyone an opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to transparent metrics going forward. The message was clear. Past inflated numbers wouldn't be held against them if they embraced honest reporting moving forward. It was both fair and strategic, focusing on improvement rather than punishment. Several division heads nodded appreciatively. If there are no further questions, Catherine concluded, you're all dismissed. Ms. Mitchell and I have some additional matters to discuss. As the executives filed out, Richard lingered, clearly hoping for a private word. Catherine, sensing this, deliberately engaged me in conversation until he was forced to leave or appear awkward. With a final frustrated glance in my direction, he exited the room. Once we were alone, Catherine smiled. That was masterfully handled, Vanessa. Professional, data-driven, and utterly unassailable. Thank you, I replied, feeling the tension I'd been holding finally release. I wanted to make it clear this isn't about personal history. Though his face when you walked in was quite something, Catherine observed with a touch of amusement. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals that generated less shock. I allowed myself a small smile. It was satisfying. He'll try to speak with you privately, Catherine warned. Men like Richard can't tolerate losing control of the narrative. I'm counting on it, I admitted. That's why I've scheduled his one-on-one for the end of the day tomorrow. Let him stew for a bit. Catherine nodded approvingly. Strategic as always. Now, are you ready for phase 2? The departmental integration team is waiting to meet their new leader. I gathered my materials, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Absolutely. This is just the beginning. As we walked toward the executive conference room where the integration team waited, Catherine paused. You know, when I first considered you for this position, I was concerned the personal connection might be problematic. Now I see it's actually an advantage. You understand exactly how Meridian's culture of inflated achievements works because you've observed it from the inside. Sometimes perceived weaknesses become our greatest strengths, I replied, thinking of how Richard had always dismissed my career as less significant than his. Indeed, Catherine agreed. Now let's go build something better than either of us could accomplish alone. The integration team meeting went smoothly, though I noticed several members glancing at me with undisguised curiosity. Word had clearly spread about my connection to Richard. I addressed it directly at the end of our session. I'm aware that some of you may have heard about my personal connection to Meridian through Mr. Mitchell, I acknowledged. I want to assure you that all assessments and decisions will be based purely on performance metrics and professional standards. Personal history has no place in business transformation. The team seemed to appreciate my directness, and the tension in the room noticeably eased. By the end of the meeting, we had established clear action items and reporting structures for the transition period. Throughout the day, I conducted 3 additional department meetings, methodically building relationships with key team members and identifying potential allies in the transformation process. I deliberately avoided the 22nd floor where Richard's division was located. That confrontation could wait until our scheduled meeting tomorrow. At 4:30, my assistant informed me that Richard had come by my office 3 times attempting to speak with me. He seemed quite insistent, Ms. Mitchell, she reported. I informed him each time that your schedule was fully booked and directed him to make an appointment. Thank you, Jessica, I replied. If he comes again, please remind him that we have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow at 5 p.m. Just as I was preparing to leave for the day, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Now. This is unprofessional, and you know it. Richard had obtained my new work number, likely through some administrative contact he'd cultivated. I considered ignoring it, but decided a clear boundary would be more effective. I typed a simple response. All division heads have received calendar invitations for their assessment meetings. Yours is scheduled for tomorrow at 5 p.m. If you have urgent operational concerns before then, please document them in an email to me and copy Catherine Westridge. This is the appropriate professional protocol. I turned off my phone and slipped it into my bag, knowing the response would infuriate him. Richard had always hated being managed or directed, particularly by women. Having his soon-to-be ex-wife establish professional boundaries would be especially galling. As I left the building through the executive entrance, I caught a glimpse of Richard waiting in the main lobby, likely hoping to intercept me. I smiled to myself as I entered the private car Catherine had arranged, watching through tinted windows as he checked his phone, his expression darkening when he read my message. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving Richard standing alone in the lobby, staring after it with a mixture of frustration and dawning comprehension. For perhaps the first time, he was beginning to understand that the dynamics between us had fundamentally, irrevocably changed, and we hadn't even had our one-on-one meeting yet. I arrived at Meridian the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The initial shock of my appearance had rippled through the company. I could feel it in the curious glances and hushed conversations that paused when I walked by. By midday, my inbox was filled with meeting requests from department heads eager to establish positive relationships with the new executive leadership. Catherine called shortly before lunch. The board is impressed with your initial assessment, she reported, particularly your identification of the reporting discrepancies. Several members had suspected issues with those numbers, but couldn't pinpoint the methodology problems. Thank ya. You? I replied, scanning the performance metrics I'd been reviewing. I'm finding similar patterns in the quarterly forecasts. Richard's team has been consistently overestimating future performance based on those inflated retention numbers, which created a cycle of increasingly unrealistic expectations, Catherine noted. Classic case of cooking the books without technically crossing legal lines. Exactly. Each exaggeration required a larger one to maintain the illusion of growth. Catherine paused. Speaking of Richard, he called me this morning. He suggested your assessment might be emotionally motivated and requested an independent review. I had expected this. It was Richard's standard defense when challenged by a woman. What did you tell him? That your analysis was reviewed and verified by our financial team before presentation, and that his personal concerns could be addressed in his scheduled meeting with you. Catherine's tone was matter-of-fact. He didn't appreciate that response. I'm sure he didn't, I agreed. Richard had always relied on male allies when feeling threatened professionally. Has he attempted to contact any other board members? 2, at least. They both referred him back to standard protocols. I could hear the satisfaction in Catherine's voice. The old boy's network he's counting on doesn't exist at Westridge. We promote based on results, not relationships. After our call, I spent the afternoon in back-to-back meetings with various department heads. Each was more prepared and receptive than the last as word spread that I was focused on solutions rather than blame. By 4:30, my throat was dry from me talking, but I felt we'd made genuine progress in establishing the framework for Meridian's transformation. At 4:55, Jessica buzzed my office. Mr. Mitchell is here for his 5 o'clock meeting. Thank you, I replied, taking a moment to center myself. Please ask him to wait 5 minutes, then show him in. The small power move was deliberate, establishing from the outset that this meeting would proceed on my terms, not his. I used those 5 minutes to review his department's performance data one final time, ensuring my assessment was unassailable. At precisely 5, Jessica opened my door. Ms. Mitchell will see you now, Mr. Mitchell. Richard entered, his body language a study in controlled tension. He'd changed his tie since the morning meeting, now wearing the red power tie he reserved for important negotiations. His expression was carefully neutral, though the muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed his agitation. Please have a seat, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk rather than the more collaborative seating area by the window. Another subtle assertion of authority. Vanessa, he began, sitting stiffly. I think we need to discuss what's happening here. I agree, I replied calmly. There are significant concerns with your division's reporting methodologies that require immediate attention. He blinked, thrown off by my professional focus. That's not what I meant. It's why this meeting was scheduled, I countered, opening the folder containing his department's assessment. Your division has been systematically overstating client retention rates and misclassifying account losses. This has created a distorted performance picture that impacts Meridian's overall business strategy. Richard leaned forward, lowering, his voice as if sharing a confidence. Look, we both know what you're doing here, using your new position to implement accurate reporting standards? I interrupted, my tone remaining professional. Yes, that's precisely what I'm doing. The same standards being applied to every division at Meridian. His facade of calm professionalism cracked slightly. This is about us, about the divorce, and you know it. I met his gaze directly. This meeting is about your department's performance. Richard, if you're unable to separate personal matters from professional responsibilities, that's concerning for someone at your level. His eyes narrowed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Getting back at me by threatening my position. Your position isn't being threatened, I clarified. Your reporting practices are being corrected. Whether that affects your position depends entirely on your willingness to implement proper protocols moving forward. I slid a document across the desk, a detailed breakdown of his division's actual performance compared to reported figures. These discrepancies weren't difficult to identify. Basic audit procedures revealed them immediately. Richard glanced at the document but didn't touch it. "You've always been jealous of my success," he said, abandoning professionalism entirely. "Even when we were married, you resented my career advancements." I had anticipated this pivot to personal attacks. It was Richard's default when cornered professionally. Rather than engaging with his accusation, I maintained my focus on the business issues. "Your division has shown a pattern of reporting verbal commitments as confirmed renewals," I continued, pointing to specific examples in the document. "Additionally, client departures have been consistently categorized as market shifts rather than losses. Both practices violate standard accounting principles and created an artificial success rate." "Every division uses creative reporting," Richard countered defensively. "You're singling me out because of our personal history." "Actually, we identified reporting inconsistencies in several departments," I replied. "Yours simply had the most significant discrepancies. The data supports this conclusion, as verified by Westridge's financial audit team." I pulled out another document, the comparative analysis I'd shown during my presentation. 3 divisions were flagged for reporting concerns. Yours ranked highest in terms of deviation from actual performance. Richard stared at the evidence, his strategy of deflection clearly failing. After a moment, he changed tactics. "Look, Vanessa," he said, his tone softening to the persuasive voice he used when trying to charm someone. "We both know this situation is unusual. Maybe we should discuss how to move forward in a way that benefits us both." "I'm glad you're ready to discuss constructive solutions," I replied, deliberately misinterpreting his suggestion. "I've outlined a 30-day plan for your division to transition to proper reporting protocols." I presented him with the implementation plan I'd prepared. This includes standardized verification procedures for client renewals and accurate classification, guidelines for account changes. Your team will receive comprehensive training next week. Richard's expression hardened as he realized his attempt at establishing complicity had failed. "And if I decide these new protocols aren't necessary for my division?" "That would be disappointing," I replied evenly. "Non-compliance with company-wide standards would naturally be reflected in your performance evaluation and could impact your position at Meridian going forward." The implied threat was clear but professionally framed. I wasn't targeting him personally, but his refusal to follow corporate standards would have consequences. Richard understood this perfectly, his face flushing with barely contained anger. "No," he said, leaning back with forced casualness. "Melanie and I were just saying last night how convenient it is that you've landed this position right when our divorce is being finalized. The timing seems strategic." The mention of Melanie was deliberate, a reminder of what he perceived as his victory in our personal life. I refused to take the bait. "The timing was determined by Westridge's acquisition schedule," I replied, simply. "Now, regarding the implementation timeline, did you know about the acquisition when I first told you I wanted a divorce?" he interrupted, still trying to drag the conversation into personal territory. "Were you already planning this?" I set down my pen and looked at him directly. "Richard, I understand this situation is uncomfortable for you. However, this meeting is scheduled to address your division's performance issues. If you'd prefer to reschedule when you're able to focus on professional matters, we can do that." The implicit message was clear. Continue this behavior, and I would document it as unprofessional conduct, adding another mark against him. Richard wasn't stupid. He recognized the warning. With visible effort, he composed himself. "That won't be necessary. Please continue." "Thank you," I said, returning to the implementation plan. "Your team will need to restate the past 2 quarters. According to the new standards, this will establish an accurate baseline for future performance assessment. Richard's jaw tightened. That will significantly impact our reported success metrics. It will reflect your actual success metrics, I corrected, which is precisely the point. For the next 20 minutes, we reviewed the specific changes required, with Richard growing increasingly quiet as he realized the full implications. His division's performance, once restated according to accurate standards, would place it in the bottom third of Meridian's departments rather than at the top where he'd positioned it for years. These changes will affect my team's bonuses, he finally said, the concern in his voice genuine. They've worked hard based on the metrics they were given. It was the first legitimate business concern he'd raised, and I acknowledged it as such. I've anticipated that issue. Westridge is implementing a one-time adjustment to ensure that staff below director level aren't financially penalized for following established practices. Your team will receive their expected bonuses this cycle. Relief flickered across his face before he registered the qualification. Below director level? Yes, I confirmed. Director-level compensation will be adjusted based on restated performance metrics. This applies to all divisions, not just yours. The implication was unmistakable. His personal bonus and stock options would be significantly reduced once the accurate numbers were applied. Given that he'd been pressuring me to sign divorce papers that didn't account for these assets, the timing couldn't have been more consequential. Richard was silent for a long moment, the full reality of his situation finally sinking in. When? He spoke again. His tone had changed completely. I assume this information will be reflected in the company's financial disclosures, he said carefully. Of course. Transparency is essential for properly functioning markets. And the divorce settlement, he asked, finally addressing directly what had been underlying our entire conversation. I closed the folder containing his department's assessment. The divorce settlement should naturally reflect all assets accurately valued, including any adjustments to performance-based compensation. I'm sure you'll want to provide updated information to both our attorneys. The corner Richard had painted himself into was now completely apparent to him. The inflated performance metrics that had boosted his career would now work against him twice, professionally in his standing at Meridian, and personally in the divorce settlement he'd been rushing to finalize before the truth emerged. I'll need time to review these protocols with my team, he said finally, gathering the documents I'd provided. Of course, I replied. I've scheduled a follow-up meeting next week to address any implementation questions. My assistant will send the calendar invitation. Richard stood, looking strangely diminished in his expensive suit. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, I didn't expect things to end this way between us. I met his gaze steadily. Neither did I, Richard. But here we are. After he left, I sat quietly in my office, processing what had just occurred. This confrontation hadn't been about revenge. It had been about truth finally emerging. About actions having their natural consequences. In insisting that I sign those divorce papers quickly, Richard had inadvertently accelerated his own professional reckoning. The universe, it seemed, had an elegant sense of timing after all. The days following, my one-on-one meeting with Richard brought a flurry of activity. Word had spread quickly through Meridian about the coming changes in reporting standards, creating two distinct reactions among the staff. Those with nothing to hide welcomed the transparency, while those who had benefited from creative accounting grew increasingly anxious. Richard's team, unsurprisingly, fell mostly into the latter category. Their reputation as Meridian's star division was being dismantled methodically as the actual performance data emerged. 3 senior members of his team requested meetings with me, each arriving with the same essential message. They had simply followed Richard's directives regarding client reporting. He insisted we classify any positive client feedback as a verbal renewal commitment, explained Marcus Chen, one of Richard's senior account directors. When I questioned the practice, he said it was standard industry methodology approved by executive leadership. And did you believe that was accurate? I asked, watching Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair. I had doubts, he admitted. But Richard made it clear that raising concerns wouldn't be beneficial for my career advancement. I heard similar stories from the others. Richard had created a culture where questioning his methods was tantamount to disloyalty. Those who complied were rewarded with promotions and bonuses. Those who hesitated found themselves sidelined or managing less prestigious accounts. Thank you for your honesty, I told each of them. Westridge values integrity, and coming forward now will be noted in your performance reviews. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled enough first-hand testimony to establish a clear pattern of deliberate misrepresentation led by Richard. I shared my findings with Catherine during our weekly briefing. This goes beyond creative accounting, she observed, reviewing the documentation. He systematically pressured his team to misrepresent client relationships. Yes, I agreed. And he leveraged the inflated performance metrics to secure larger bonuses and stock options, which directly impacted his compensation package. Catherine studied me carefully. How are you handling the personal dimension of this situation? It can't be easy discovering the extent of his professional deception on top of everything else. I considered her question thoughtfully. In truth, Richard's professional behavior didn't surprise me. I had glimpsed his ethical flexibility throughout our marriage in small ways that I'd chosen to overlook. What surprised me was my own response. Not anger or vindication, but a calm, clarity about both our past and my future. Actually, it's clarifying, I answered honestly. For years, I questioned whether I was overreacting to his dismissiveness, whether I should have been more supportive of his career even as he belittled mine. Now I see the whole picture. His success was partly built on deception, while he criticized my legitimate achievements. Catherine nodded with understanding. Sometimes seeing someone clearly is the best closure. She straightened the papers on her desk. So, what's your recommendation for handling his division? A complete restructuring, I replied without hesitation. The current reporting structure enabled the problems. We need to implement proper checks and balances, which means reorganizing the leadership team. Including Richard's position? Especially Richard's position. The director role should be split into two complementary positions, client strategy and performance analytics, with different reporting lines to prevent future manipulation. And Richard himself? Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already anticipated my answer. He has two options, I explained, outlining the strategy I'd developed. He can accept a lateral move to head our new business development division, where his relationship-building skills would be valuable, but his ability to manipulate existing accounts would be limited, or he can accept a severance package. Catherine smiled approvingly. Perfectly reasonable professionally while giving him a C. Difficult choice personally. She picked up her pen. Let's schedule a meeting to present these options to him on Monday. The weekend provided a welcome respite from the intensity of the workplace dynamics. I spent Saturday morning at my attorney's office, updating her on the emerging financial information that would impact our divorce settlement. This changes the asset valuation considerably, Ms. Abernathy noted, reviewing the documentation of Richard's actual compensation. His performance-based bonuses and stock options were significantly inflated by the misleading metrics. Yes, I confirmed. When restated according to accurate standards, his total compensation for the past 3 years is approximately 30% lower than what he's been reporting. Ms. Abernathy's eyes gleamed with professional satisfaction. And he's been pushing for a quick settlement based on those inflated numbers, arguing that you're not entitled to the full value of his hard-earned success. Exactly. This is fortuitous timing, she observed carefully. It's truthful timing, I corrected. I'm not manipulating the situation. I'm ensuring accurate information is used in both professional and personal contexts. Of course, she agreed, making notes in her file. I'll prepare an amended proposal that reflects the actual asset values. Would you like me to contact Richard's attorney immediately, or wait until after your meeting with him on Monday? I considered the question strategically. Let's wait. I want him to make his employment decision without additional pressure. Once that's resolved, we can address the divorce settlement with complete information. Sunday brought unexpected developments. At 10 a.m., my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Melanie standing on my porch, looking distinctly uncomfortable. She wore casual clothes rather than her usual office attire, and her normally perfect makeup seemed hastily applied. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Come in." In my kitchen, the same space where days earlier she had hovered impatiently while Richard pressured me to sign the divorce papers, Melanie now sat nervously, her hands wrapped around the mug of coffee I'd offered. "I didn't know," she began abruptly. "About the reporting issues, I mean. Richard always said his methods were standard practice, approved by leadership." I studied her carefully, noting the dark circles under her eyes partially concealed by concealer. "The same leadership he claimed didn't recognize my professional capabilities?" She flinched slightly. "He said a lot of things that I'm starting to realize weren't accurate." "Why are you here, Melanie?" I asked directly. "This can't be a comfortable conversation for either of us." She set down her mug. "I've been offered a position in the marketing division, a lateral move away from communication strategy. I wanted to know if that came from you." "The restructuring will affect the entire division," I explained, neither confirming nor denying my direct involvement. "All team members are being assessed for appropriate placement based on their skills and performance, so it's not personal?" The question hung between us, loaded with the unspoken acknowledgement of her affair with my husband. "Westridge makes business decisions based on performance metrics and organizational needs," I replied carefully. "Individual. Employees are evaluated on their professional contributions, not their personal relationships." Relief visibly washed over her. "Thank you. I was worried. That I would punish you professionally for a personal situation?" I finished for her. She nodded, looking embarrassed. "That's not how I operate, Melanie. It's not how Westridge operates either." She seemed to struggle with what to say next. "Richard's been difficult since your meeting. He says you're deliberately undermining him, using your position to get revenge." "And what do you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. Melanie stared into her coffee. "I think he's panicking because he can't control the narrative anymore. He's used to being able to shape how people see situations, including me." She glanced up briefly. "He told me you were bitter about his success, that you'd tried to hold him back professionally." I couldn't help the small, incredulous laugh that escaped me. "I edited his presentations, researched his competitors, hosted dinner parties for his clients, and listened to practice runs of every major pitch he ever gave." "I know that now," she said quietly. "The past few days, things have been emerging that don't match what he told me about your marriage. About you." I felt a surprising lack of satisfaction at her disillusionment. Whatever narrative Richard had created about me, Melanie had been a willing audience, accepting his characterization without question until it directly affected her. "Relationships are complex," I said finally. "I'm sure Richard believed his version of events, just as he believed his reporting methods were justified." "He's talking about fighting the restructuring," she volunteered. "Contacting board members, claiming discrimination based on your personal history." This wasn't surprising, but her willingness to share it was. "Why are you telling me this?" Melanie met my eyes directly for the first time. "Because I'm starting to understand that being associated with his approach might not be the advantage. I thought it was, The marketing director said they selected me for the transfer because of my skills, not my connection to Richard. It's the first time anyone at Meridian has valued me independently. The irony wasn't lost on me. We had both, in different ways, been defined by our relationship to Richard rather than recognized for our own capabilities. Take the marketing position, I advised her. Build your career on your actual talents, not on someone else's perception of your value. After Melanie left, I spent the afternoon finalizing my strategy for Monday's meeting with Richard. His attempt to rally support against the restructuring wasn't unexpected, but it required careful handling. I prepared documentation for every aspect of the reorganization, ensuring each decision was supported by solid business rationale and comparative industry data. By Sunday evening, I had received emails from 2 Westridge board members, each mentioning that Richard had contacted them with concerns about the Meridian reorganization. Both had referred him back to standard protocols, but the pattern was clear. He was attempting to circumvent my authority by appealing to what he assumed was an old boys' network. I forwarded these communications to Catherine with a brief note. As anticipated, all documentation ready for tomorrow's meeting. Her response came minutes later. Board is fully briefed and supportive. Proceed as planned. Monday morning, I arrived at Meridian early, reviewing the final details of the restructuring. Presentation: Jessica brought in the latest reports from the financial audit team, which confirmed our initial findings. When accurately stated, Richard's division had underperformed compared to its targets for the past 6 quarters. Mr. Mitchell has been calling every 15 minutes, Jessica informed me. He's insisting on speaking with you before the scheduled meeting. Please remind him that our meeting is at 11 a.m., and all relevant topics will be addressed then, I replied, continuing my review of the documentation. At 10:30, my phone rang with Catherine's direct line. Richard just left my office, she reported. He attempted to make a case that the restructuring is personally motivated and suggested an external consultant should review the plan. How did you respond? I asked, though I could guess from her amused tone. I informed him that the restructuring plan had already been reviewed by our corporate strategy team and approved by the board. I also suggested that focusing on the opportunities in the new structure might be more productive than challenging its necessity. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect, Catherine replied dryly. He mentioned something about consulting his attorney, then left rather abruptly. Be prepared for a confrontational meeting. At precisely 11 a.m., Richard arrived at my office. Unlike our previous meeting, he brought reinforcements, Marcus Chen and 2 other senior members of his team. The move was transparent. He was hoping to intimidate me with a show of departmental solidarity. I see you've brought colleagues, I observed calmly. However, this meeting was scheduled as a one-on-one to discuss your specific role in the restructuring. What affects me affects my entire team, Richard replied with forced confidence. They deserve to know what's happening to their division. I noticed the uncomfortable expressions on his colleagues' faces. This had not been their idea. I appreciate your concern for your team, I said. However, as you know, I've already met individually with each senior team member to discuss their roles in the new structure. Today's meeting is specifically about your position. The implied message was clear. His team already knew about their places in the reorganization. Richard had brought them under the false pretense that they needed his protection. Seeing the realization dawn on their faces, I decided to be merciful. Gentlemen, I addressed his colleagues directly. I understand your concern for your department. I've scheduled a comprehensive team briefing tomorrow morning where the complete restructuring will be presented. For now, I need to speak with Richard privately about matters specific to his role. Marcus Chen stood first. We'll see you at tomorrow's briefing then, he said, nodding respectfully in my direction. The others followed his lead, leaving Richard alone, his show of solidarity evaporating at the first challenge. As the door closed behind them, Richard's composed facade cracked slightly. Dividing and conquering, Vanessa. I taught you well. Actually, I replied calmly, I learned that particular lesson watching you take credit for your team's work for years. Now, shall we discuss your options in the new organizational structure? With his team members gone, Richard sat rigidly across from my desk. The office felt charged with the tension of our shared history and the dramatic power shift between us. Let me guess, he said bitterly. You've decided to eliminate my position entirely. The perfect revenge. I slid the restructuring plans across the desk. Actually, I'm offering you two options, both preserving your employment. This isn't about revenge, Richard. It's about creating a more effective organization. The first option is a lateral move to head our new business development division. You'd maintain your current compensation level. His eyes narrowed. And the second option? A severance package, 6-month salary, accelerated vesting of your stock options at their accurately valued level, and standard benefits. Richard scanned the documents quickly. You're splitting my division, creating two roles where there was one. Yes. Client strategy and performance analytics will operate separately with different reporting structures. This creates necessary checks and balances to ensure accurate performance assessment. And who will head these new departments? Marcus. Chen will lead client strategy. Alicia Washington will head performance analytics. Two of his most talented team members, both of whom he had sidelined when they questioned his methods. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. I see you've planned this thoroughly, he said, dismantling everything I've built. Correcting what was built on misleading foundations, I clarified. The reorganization affects every division, not just yours. Richard leaned back, studying me. I never really knew you, did I? The question caught me off guard. Perhaps neither of us knew the other, as well as we thought. A flash of genuine emotion crossed his face, something close to regret. When did you become this? He gestured vaguely toward me. I've always been this person, Richard. You just never bothered to look beyond what you wanted to see. I tapped the documents. You have until Wednesday to decide. Both options are fair and preserve your professional dignity. Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window. When he turned, his expression had hardened. This could look very bad. Ex-wife takes position of power and immediately targets her husband's division? The optics aren't great, Vanessa. The optics of systematic misrepresentation of client relationships aren't great either, I replied calmly, especially when documented by multiple team members and verified by independent auditors. His confident expression faltered. What are you talking about? I opened another folder. 3 senior members of your team have provided detailed statements about how they were instructed to record verbal commitments as confirmed renewals and classify client departures as market shifts. Richard's face paled. They were following established practices. Established by you, not by Meridian's official protocols, I clarified, which is precisely why we need the restructuring. He stared at the documents for a long moment. And the divorce settlement? Your attorney will receive updated financial disclosures reflecting the accurate valuation of your compensation. The settlement will proceed based on these factual values. Richard's jaw tightened. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've ensured that both professional and personal matters are handled with appropriate transparency, I replied. Something that should have been the standard all along. As he rose to leave, Richard paused. For what it's worth, I never intended our marriage to end this way. Neither did I replied honestly. But our choices led us here. Yours and mine, both. Wednesday arrived with a formal email from Richard, accepting the business development position. That same afternoon, his attorney contacted mine with a revised settlement proposal that accurately reflected his compensation and assets. The aggressive demands of his initial offer had been replaced with equitable terms that recognized our 15 years together. 2 weeks later, as the restructuring implementation progressed smoothly, Catherine invited me to lunch. "The board is impressed with how you've handled the Meridian integration," she told me. "Particularly the situation with Richard. You managed it with remarkable professionalism." "Thank you," I replied. It was important that the process remain focused on business necessities rather than personal history. "Not everyone could separate the two so effectively," Catherine observed. In a strange way, the professional clarity helped resolve the personal situation. Once the actual facts were established in one arena, they naturally extended to the other. And Richard? Surprisingly effective in business development. Without the pressure to maintain artificial success metrics, he's focusing on what he genuinely does best. As we finished lunch, Catherine mentioned the next phase of Westridge's expansion, potential acquisitions in the European market. "Would you be interested in heading that initiative? It would mean relocating to London for at least a year." The opportunity was immediately appealing. A chance to expand my horizons beyond the situation with Richard, to build something entirely new. "I'd be very interested," I replied without hesitation. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. What had begun as personal heartbreak had transformed into professional opportunity beyond anything I could have imagined. My phone buzzed with a text from my realtor. An offer had come in on my house, well above asking price. With my upcoming move to London, the timing couldn't have been better. Another piece falling perfectly into place. I smiled, thinking of Richard's shock when I'd first walked into that conference room as his new boss. That moment had been satisfying, but the real victory wasn't in his recognition of my power. It was in my recognition of my own capability, independent of his or anyone else's validation. Sometimes life's most painful detours lead to unexpected destinations. Richard leaving me had seemed like an ending. Instead, it had become the beginning of something far more meaningful, the discovery of my own strength and the freedom to define myself not as someone's wife, but as exactly who I was meant to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Life rarely unfolds as we expect, but sometimes its greatest challenges reveal our hidden strengths. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing for more tales of transformation and resilience. Remember that your worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift. It gives you the space to build something remarkable while no one is watching. Until next time, this is Vanessa Mitchell signing off from London, where new adventures await.